Welcome to Iron Sharpens Iron. My name is Jeremy Nettles. I'm the evangelist for the River Ridge Church of Christ that meets in Newburgh, Indiana at 5600 Van Road. We'd love to have you join us for our 10 a.m. worship, and you can get here an hour early at 9 next week for our Bible study as well. You could also join us this afternoon at 4 for our afternoon worship, and we have another set of Bible studies on Wednesday evenings at 7, and we'd love to have you come for those too. You can get in touch with us by phone at 812-550-6234 or send an email to info@riverridgechurch.org, and we would love to hear from you and get back to you as soon as we can. I've got a long-running series on this show in which we've been looking at the books of the Bible. This week we're looking at one of the shorter ones, one of the minor prophets named Nahum. Nahum is among the least well-known books in the entire Bible. It's a difficult book to find because it's so short. It's in the Minor Prophets section of the Old Testament, sandwiched between two of the minor prophets that get a lot more credit these days, Micah and Habakkuk. Not to say that either of those is particularly well-known either, but at least they get more credit than Nahum does. Hardly anyone gives any of the minor prophets much attention, but you might recognize at least a handful of verses from a book like Micah or Habakkuk, and you might even see somebody proclaiming a passage from either of those to be one's favorite verse in the Bible, despite having a very limited understanding of what it actually, means. Well, that's not really a problem with Nahum, because there are no oft-repeated verses. You won't find a stenciled verse on Etsy or at Hobby Lobby or anything like that. On top of that, there are no New Testament quotations from the book of Nahum. Now, there may be one person out there who's saying, hang on, Jeremy, Paul quotes Nahum, because in Nahum 1:15 we read, "Behold upon the mountains the feet of him who brings good news, who publishes peace." And Romans chapter 10, verse 15, Paul says, "And how are they to preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who preach the good news." So why did you say that there were no New Testament quotations from Nahum, Well, yeah, but you see, the thing is, Isaiah 52 verse 7 says, "How beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of him who brings good news, who publishes peace." And Isaiah predates Nahum by a substantial margin. So it's not that Paul is quoting Nahum, it's that Nahum is quoting Isaiah, and so is Paul. That's how obscure Nahum is. And yet it's part of a powerful story, and this story has lessons to teach us today. Who wrote Nahum? Well, we get some information about him in verse 1. An oracle concerning Nineveh, the book of the vision of Nahum of Elkosh. Yeah, that actually sums up everything we know about Nahum the man. He's associated with what we presume to be a place named Elkosh. Wherever that is, we don't know. All right, to whom is it written? Chapter 1, verse 1 said that it was about Nineveh, so it's for Nineveh. Well, sort of. It's not actually to Nineveh. That's not what it said. It said an oracle concerning Nineveh. It's about Nineveh. Most of the book does address Nineveh, but also chapter 1, verse 15, which we read a moment ago. The latter part of the verse says, "Keep your feasts, O Judah, fulfill your vows, for never again shall the worthless pass through you, he is utterly cut off." So that's to God's people, Judah, not to the Assyrian city of Nineveh. Further, chapter 2, verse 2, "For the Lord is restoring the majesty of Jacob as the majesty of Israel, for plunderers have plundered them and ruined their branches." Now that's in the third person, but at least it concerns the nation, or the remainder of the nation of Israel. This book is obviously intended for the Jews, but it's about and against Nineveh, this capital city of the Assyrian Empire for a long stretch, right up until about the year 612 BC. Coincidentally, the city of Nineveh fell to a coalition of its own former vassal states whose armies destroyed the city in 612 BC. Nahum prophesied, sometime before this, likely in the neighborhood of about 630 BC, or maybe a bit earlier than that, we don't know exactly, but he was predicting that the city would fall and be destroyed. For context, the northern kingdom of Israel had long since fallen to the Assyrian Empire, ruled by Nineveh, in the year 723 BC. And in 700 BC, it looked like the southern kingdom of Judah was going to fall as well, until God stepped in and put a stop to it, and the Assyrian king Sennacherib was left nursing his pride and trying to pass it off as some kind of dubious victory or a totally normal change of plans. Yeah, I'm sure that's what it was. Anywho, the Assyrian Empire continued to Assyrian Empire for another few decades, and things were pretty great for Nineveh if you ignore all of the wanton slaughter and such. From Nineveh, the Assyrian kings ruled a vast empire, which they maintained by the use of brutal force. They were highly skilled in inventing new ways to cause pain and shame, and they used these as techniques to discourage dissent among the people they ruled. Now, about 100 to 150 years prior to the city's destruction, and perhaps Nahum's prophesying, God sent another prophet named Jonah to Nineveh to proclaim God's intentions of letting the city be overthrown due to its evil and violence. Surprisingly, the city repented, and God relented. And then they went right back to what they had been doing over the next couple generations, and that brings us to Nahum. Let's pick up where we left off in chapter 1, verse 2. The Lord is a jealous and avenging God. The Lord is avenging and wrathful. The Lord takes vengeance on his adversaries and keeps wrath for his enemies. The Lord is slow to anger and great in power, and the Lord will by no means clear the guilty. His way is in whirlwind and storm, and the clouds are the dust of his feet. He rebukes the sea and makes it dry. He dries up all the rivers. Bashan and Carmel wither. The bloom of Lebanon withers. From the outset, we're looking at God's character, which is the reason that he is about to step in and execute judgment. The way that he is described is a reference to the name of God, which God himself proclaimed to Moses in Exodus 34, verses 6 and 7. The Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children, and the children's children to the third and the fourth generation. Which, in turn, was part of Jonah's complaint about God's attitude toward the city of Nineveh. And he prayed to the Lord and said, O Lord, is not this what I said when I was yet in my country? That is why I made haste to flee to Tarshish, for I knew that you are a gracious God and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love, and relenting from disaster. So what we're seeing here from the beginning of Nahum is a veiled reference back to Jonah and to Exodus, and the story that has played out in Nineveh so far, how Nineveh has previously escaped disaster because of God's characteristics of being merciful and slow to anger. But now, since the people have gone back, the same characteristics of God, that he does not clear the guilty and exacts vengeance on them, well, those characteristics now are going to mean judgment for this city. What's coming as God goes to war? Verse 8, with an overflowing flood, he will make a complete end of the adversaries, and will pursue his enemies into darkness. Is that just a metaphor? I don't think we have enough information yet, but let's keep that in mind, this overwhelming flood. As chapter 1 wraps up, God turns his attention toward his people, verses 12 and 13. Thus says the Lord, though they are at full strength and many, they will be cut down and pass away. Though I have afflicted you, I will afflict you no more. And now I will break his yoke from off you, and will burst your bonds apart. They are the people of Nineveh, and you are the people of Israel and Judah, who have laid this heavy yoke and these tight bonds on God's people. And, by the way, he is referring to another Old Testament passage, Psalm 2. There are additional points of contact here in verses 7, 9, and 11. Psalm 2 describes Gentile kings conspiring to throw off the yoke of David's reign, and looking forward to similar attitudes which would be shown toward the son of David, Jesus. But let's not get distracted by that just yet. And now God says that he is going to throw the yoke of the Assyrians off of his people, and he's going to break their bonds asunder in the way that they sought to break God's chosen king's bond asunder. And then he turns his attention back to Nineveh in verse 14. The Lord has given commandment about you. No more shall your name be perpetuated. From the house of your gods I will cut off the carved image and the metal image. I will make your grave, for you are vile. Assyria had afflicted Judah, and God says this will not happen anymore. It's like learning that the school bully has been expelled. It doesn't look great for the school bully, but for his victims who have been living in constant fear, this is great news. Now they can breathe a little easier. The news for Nineveh is not so rosy. Chapter 2, verse 1. The scatterer has come up against you. Man the ramparts, watch the road, dress for battle, collect all your strength. For the Lord is restoring the majesty of Jacob as the majesty of Israel, for plunderers have plundered them and ruined their branches. I wanted to keep going, but we need to take a break to contextualize, and it would be a crime against the text to put it in the middle of the next section. So, by what means is God planning to punish Nineveh? By means of men with spears and swords. He's even giving his enemy a warning. He's telling them from a position of the utmost confidence, go ahead and get ready. I'm not worried. The prophet frames this coming battle as the elevation of Israel. So the Israelites would be the ones to conquer and destroy Nineveh? Well, I can see why they might have thought this on reading this text here, but that's not what it says. Israel has been plundered, but will have its majesty restored. That doesn't mean that Israel will be the one to conquer. Instead, God will use other nations to devastate Nineveh, and the fact of that vengeance is comfort to the victims of Nineveh's cruel treatment in the past. In fact, those who captured and destroyed Nineveh would be rebels from Assyria's own kingdom, and long-held tributaries and servants. We'll talk more about them shortly. But we're ready for the next section, verses 3 through 9. The shield of his mighty men is red. His soldiers are clothed in scarlet. The chariots come with flashing metal on the day he musters them. The cypress spears are brandished. The chariots race madly through the streets. They rush to and fro through the squares. They gleam like torches. They dart like lightning. He remembers his officers. They stumble as they go. They hasten to the wall. The siege tower is set up. The river gates are opened. The palace melts away. Its mistress is stripped. She is carried off, her slave girls lamenting, moaning like doves and beating their breasts. Nineveh is like a pool whose waters run away. Halt, halt, they cry, but none turns back. Plunder the silver, plunder the gold. There is no end of the treasure or of the wealth of all precious things. This section is stylistically incredible, even in translation. These short, choppy sentences evoke the chaos and single-mindedness of battle. There's tons of vivid detail, and it helps us to picture the scene in our mind's eye. You've got the color of the invader's livery. It's red, which is a regal color, but it also evokes visions of blood. You've got the invader's chariots tearing through the streets, dispensing random violence and death from which there is no safe hiding place, and no way to outrun, which is just as well because there's nowhere to go. What's with the river gates mentioned in verse 6? River gates. It sounds like a device for controlling access to the city by water, but it's more complex than that. See, this here is a picture of the modern-day city of Mosul, Iraq, or at least part of it. If you look carefully, you can easily see the outline of ancient Nineveh, which I will highlight here. For scale, this is about 3.5 miles long and 2 miles wide, or a bit under 7 square miles. And for comparison, the city of Mosul in total is 70 square miles. Whereas Mosul today has a population of a bit under 2 million, ancient Nineveh had a population somewhere around 100,000 to 200,000. That sounds like it's quite small in comparison, but that actually put it in the running for the largest and most populous city in the world at that time. What else do we notice? Well, there's a river running here to the west of the old city. That's the Tigris River. And then there's this weird squiggly line here that doesn't look quite natural, but it's also clearly not the product of modern city planning. It looks like it leads directly to the river, but it's more or less dry now. For that matter, there are also these similar little trenches over here to the southeast, which are at least partly filled with water and are pretty clearly man-made, even if they're not modern. In actual fact, once upon a time, these little bits were once part of a moat that surrounded the entire city of Nineveh, and were fed by the Kosser River, which was a tributary of the Tigris and around which the city of Nineveh was built. Over time, the people of Nineveh refined and adapted this system, including dams and reservoirs, to provide the city with a steady supply of fresh water. It's really clever. How'd we get on this topic again? Right, it was the river gates. What's up with that? Well, clearly there would need to be some kind of gate mechanism to prevent would-be invaders from just hopping on a boat and bypassing this nice fancy wall and then taking the river right into town. But it's even more complicated than that. It's about the reservoirs and sluices. It's not a gate on the river to control the flow of people. It's rather gates intended to control the flow of water. And what happened? Well, as Nahum put it, chapter 2, verse 6, the river gates are opened, the palace melts away. There's an account from Diodorus Siculus which must be taken with a grain of salt, but let's take a look at it. Now there was a prophecy which had come down to the king from his ancestors. No enemy will ever take Ninus, that's Nineveh, by storm unless the river shall first become the city's enemy. Assuming, therefore, that this would never be, he held out in hope, his thought being to endure the siege and await the troops which would be sent from his subjects. The rebels, elated at their successes, pressed the siege, but because of the strength of the walls, they were unable to do any harm to the men in the city. For neither engines for throwing stones, nor shelters for sappers, nor battering rams devised to overthrow walls had as yet been invented at that time. Moreover, the inhabitants of the city had a great abundance of all provisions, since the king had taken thought on that score. Consequently, the siege dragged on, and for 2 years they pressed their attack, making assaults on the walls and preventing inhabitants of the city from going out into the country. But in the 3rd year, after there had been heavy and continuous rains, it came to pass that the Euphrates, running very full, both inundated a portion of the city and broke down the walls for a distance of 20 stades, which is about 2.3 miles. At this, the king, believing the oracle had been fulfilled and that the river had plainly become the city's enemy, abandoned hope of saving himself. And in order that he might not fall into the hands of the enemy, he built an enormous pyre in his palace, heaped upon it all his gold and silver, as well as every article of the royal wardrobe, and then, shutting his concubines and eunuchs in the room which had been built in the middle of the pyre, he consigned both them and himself and his palace to the flames. The rebels, on learning of the death of Sardanapalus, took the city by forcing an entrance where the wall had fallen, and clothing Arbaces in the royal garb, saluted him as king, and put in his hands the supreme authority. Now, like I said, grain of salt. There are obvious problems with this account. First of all, siege engines like catapults and such had, in fact, been invented already. Whether this coalition had access to any, I don't know, but the Assyrians themselves had long used siege towers, like shelters, and battering rams. They were the ones who invented the technology, for crying out loud, and Diodorus says, oh, these backward Eastern folk, they didn't know about the advanced technology that we smart people use today. On top of that, Diodorus calls the river the Euphrates. Wrong river, bud. Nineveh sits on the Tigris. So given that he was wrong about everything we know independently, we shouldn't take his word as fact about the things we don't know from anywhere else, but he at least probably has the basic gist of it right. It sounds like what happened is that the leaders of this coalition took control of the flow of water and took advantage of some unusually heavy rains upstream, and then filled up the reservoirs to the maximum and let it all loose at once to inundate the city. Or, as Nahum put it, the river gates are opened, the palace melts away. There's probably some metaphor there, since the palace is way up here in the stronghold and also the highest point of the city, but nevertheless, the metaphor makes good sense. The city was flooded, and as the walls, the houses, the possessions were washed away, it seemed like the resolve among the leadership also washed away at the same time, and left the people of the city to be slaughtered. Which brings us to chapter 2, verse 10. Desolate, desolation and ruin. Hearts melt and knees tremble. Anguish is in all loins. All faces grow pale. Where is the lion's den, the feeding place of the young lions, where the lion and lioness went, where his cubs were, with none to disturb? The lion tore enough for his cubs and strangled prey for his lionesses. He filled his caves with prey and his dens with torn flesh. Behold, I am against you, declares the Lord of hosts, and I will burn your chariots in smoke, and the sword shall devour your young lions. I will cut off your prey from the earth, and the voice of your messengers shall no longer be heard. Lest we begin feeling overly sympathetic to the poor unsuspecting people of Nineveh, let's remember, these people were quite content to profit off merciless brutality toward others. They were the lion cubs, and happily received the spoil of their parents' rapacious ruthlessness. By the way, maybe now's a good time to point out that the Assyrians were very fond of lion imagery. They put the imposing figure of lions all over their palaces and public works. God saying, well, the den's about to be emptied. They shored themselves up to the point they didn't have to be afraid of anyone or anything. They built ramparts, they posted lookouts, they armed themselves for battle, they trained for battle, they designed this fantastic wall and moat and water supply systems, they built majestic palaces and temples along with fortresses, they stored up vast wealth which they had taken by force from all the peoples around them, they left generous provision for the next generation so they too could grow up strong and ferocious and ready to keep pursuing that aggressive military policy of subjugating their neighbors and plundering any potential threat. And none of that saved them from God's wrath. This reminds me of Jesus' parable of the rich fool in Luke chapter 12, beginning in verse 16. The land of a rich man produced plentifully, and he thought to himself, what shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops. And he said, I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry. But God said to him, Fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be? So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. And I'd love to shift gears there, but we're not done with Nahum yet. Chapter 3, verse 1. Woe to the bloody city, all full of lies and plunder, no end to the prey. In quick succession, we've seen several of Nineveh's offenses. Violence beyond what was even remotely justifiable, lies, the misrepresentation of the nature of reality, and the deliberate misguiding of others for their own personal gain, and then plundering and prey, this consuming ferocious greed which is never satisfied. The next section is another great piece of writing. It begins with a string of verbal images, as if you're standing in the middle of Nineveh while the enemy breaches the defenses and chaos breaks out within. Let's read verses 2 through 7. The crack of the whip and rumble of the wheel, galloping horse and bounding chariot, horsemen charging, flashing sword and glittering spear, hosts of slain, heaps of corpses, dead bodies without end. They stumble over the bodies, and all for the countless whorings of the prostitute, graceful and of deadly charms, who betrays nations with her whorings and peoples with her charms. Behold, I am against you, declares the Lord of hosts, and will lift up your skirts over your head, and I will make nations look at your nakedness, and kingdoms at your shame. I will throw filth at you, and treat you with contempt, and make you a spectacle. And all who look at you will shrink from you, and say, Wasted is Nineveh. Who will grieve for her? Where shall I seek comforters for you? Well, that's rather vivid. It also introduces another metaphor. Now the city is a prostitute, using her idolatry and her economic or political corruption to lead other nations into sin, evil, with no care for how it affects them in the end, so long as it leads to gain for Nineveh. And as she has humiliated others, so God will humiliate her. It's oddly tragic that she engaged in this prostitution in order to gain supporters and friends and sustenance. But when it all falls apart, none of them cares about her because she hasn't given them anything meaningful. In fact, she's only caused harm to them. There's no love, just interactions governed by base desire and convenience, like men visiting a prostitute. Chapter 3, verse 18. Your shepherds are asleep, O king of Assyria. Your nobles slumber. Your people are scattered on the mountains with none to gather them. There is no easing your hurt. Your wound is grievous. All who hear the news about you clap their hands over you, for upon whom has not come your unceasing evil? The message is, time's up, judgment is coming. A handful of people will escape the slaughter and become refugees, but the once mighty nation of Assyria, which ruled the world for all intents and purposes, will fall, never to rise again. There's no kernel of hope. There's no limiting principle, just unending pain and sorrow. There's not even any pity to be found with God or with Assyria's neighbors. Which is no surprise. Look at how they treated everyone around them. Why would anybody feel sympathetic? On the contrary, they laugh and mock Nineveh's suffering. Does that seem mean-spirited? Well, it is, but it's the human condition. Go to the internet and search for instant karma. For the record, karma is a bogus concept from what amounts to a pagan religion, Hinduism, but in the Western popular conscience it's taken to mean the world gives you what you deserve. That's even more absurd than the Hindu concept, which, while wrong, is at least somewhat understandable. But God makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust. Yet we do tend to take some visceral pleasure in seeing those common cases where a person's obviously bad actions come around to smack them, and while that's far from universal, and is not anything close to the whole story, it is also one of God's tools. Proverbs 26:27, whoever digs a pit will fall into it, and a stone will come back on him who starts it rolling. Psalm 7:16, his mischief returns upon his own head, and on his own skull his violence descends. It's easy to fall into a perverse delight at the sufferings of the wicked, but what should the wicked expect? You treated everyone else like garbage, and now you're getting a taste of your own medicine. Well, don't come crying to me for help. It wasn't long ago you were inflicting this sort of anguish on me and mine, so you can go take a long walk off a short pier, and I'm just going to sit back and watch. That's the idea anyway. And it's terrifying because while in this world that kind of end is generally reserved for the worst of the worst, what do those who watch and laugh without mercy also deserve? They're not perfect, and they're demonstrating it even while they laugh at the fate of Nineveh. In Matthew chapter 5, Jesus says, beginning in verse 43, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' But I say to you, love your enemies, and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? You therefore must be perfect, as your heavenly Father is perfect." Nahum, on the whole, is depressing. Most of the minor prophets, even the angry and gloomy ones, end on a positive note, a promise of forgiveness and restoration and blessing to come. Not Nahum. It just ends with a rhetorical question that should make the people of Nineveh wish they'd never been born. He's not the only minor prophet to end with a question, actually. The other one is Jonah, chapter 4, verse 11. God says, "And should I not pity Nineveh, that great city in which there are more than 120,000 persons who do not know their right hand from their left, and also much cattle?" Isn't that funny? They're both about Nineveh. One details the city's repentance and God's mercy. Jonah ended with Nineveh on the right track and God's own prophet steeping in his hatred for the city, while God gently tries to teach the prophet about goodness and mercy. Nahum ends with God's patience exhausted, asking Nineveh, well, what'd you expect to happen when you went right back to your evil? And this is also a New Testament principle, 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 22. What the true proverb says has happened to them. The dog returns to its own vomit, and the sow, after washing herself, returns to wallow in the mire. Ultimately, that's where Nahum leaves us, seeing the spiritual play out in the physical world, and I hope impelling each of us to consider what it means for himself. It's easy to find someone more evil than you are. If nothing else, I can always fall back on, but at least I didn't murder 6 million Jews like Hitler. Thing is, God's not just asking you to be less evil than Hitler or Stalin or Pol Pot or Genghis Khan or whoever is your preferred historical boogeyman to stand in for Satan because you struggle to believe the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places exist. Jesus said, you must be perfect, and that's a problem, because you're not. Neither am I. In the context of the sermon in which Jesus said that, what was the other shoe? What's the result of not being perfect, and what's the alternative? Matthew 5, verse 20, "For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." That sounds important. So if I'm not perfect, then I don't get to enter? Well, then what? Well, then you get cast into the outer darkness where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth. Or, as Nahum put it, using the physical example, thinking in spiritual terms, there is no easing your hurt. Your wound is grievous. All who hear the news about you clap their hands over you, for upon whom has not come your unceasing evil. So if no one's perfect, is that the end laid up for all of us? Yeah. But Jesus offers mercy, and he offers to rescue you from your enslavement to sin and that inevitable end, and to remold you in his image, making you righteous in truth. He promises to stand between you and his Father on the last day, and to claim you as his own, admitting you to his kingdom on the basis that your record of sins is blotted out, and you are perfect. If you need to join the body of Christ, to join Christ in a death, burial, and resurrection, then I encourage you to reach out to us at River Ridge, and we would love to help. You can get in touch by phone at 812-550-6234 or email us at info@riverridgechurch.org. You can also find us at 5600 Van Road in Newburgh for Sunday morning worship at 10. I hope to see you there. Thanks for joining me today on Iron Sharpens Iron.